Good evening. Welcome to the QCIS channel. We're on this channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is a short PowerPoint presentation on types of ADA ramps. Now, when you are at an intersection, particularly in a number of urban areas, you see a crosswalk, then you see some what I call depressed ramps as they go into the street with a detectable warning surface. You might see some return curb. You might even see some pedestrian poles. Well, those are ADA ramps. And when new pavement is being placed, sometimes the ramps are affected because you have to look at drainage. And sometimes the ramps are out of specification. So what we do is we take a little smart level and we check the slopes. We check the algebraic slopes. We check the cross slopes. We even check the width of your detectable warning surfaces. But even before we get into all of that, one thing that you need to know is that there are different types of ramps. Many of us don't know that. We'll go out there with a piece of paper and we start checking the ramps. Certainly, they are in compliance and some of them aren't in compliance. But what type of ramp are you inspecting? And it's very important from my point of view of what type of ramp you're inspecting, because these ramps are put at different corners. They could be put between islands. It's very important that these ramps are in specification. Now, of course, all this ADA information came about in the 90s with the American with Disabilities Act, but it's very important. Now, I'm also going to do a video on what to look for in these ramps. But this one, you need to know what type of ramp you're looking at. Now, for this one, I'm going to get more into, and this is actually from a former co-worker or a former organization that I used to work for. It's PennDOT. But basically, when you're in road construction, every state might have a different way of getting to the same pinnacle. And that's making sure that all of the ADA ramps are in compliance. Now, the name of tonight's topic, we're going to talk about the types of curb ramps. This is what you need to know before you actually go out there to inspect. You need to know the location of the ramps. Like, okay, if we have four corners, you cut the four corners in quads: northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. So we talk about curb ramps. We also have what we call directional descriptions: diagonal curb ramps, or perpendicular curb ramps, or parallel curb ramps. Now, basically, here's what a parallel curb ramp in line with a pedestrian path looks like. As you see, it's depressed. Here's the crosswalk. Now, a parallel curb ramp is installed in the same direction as a pedestrian. The pedestrian does not perform a turning maneuver, and therefore a landing is not required. Now, what is a turning maneuver? Let's say you have a sidewalk and then you have a second ramp. It looks like a T. Well, in order to get to this part of the intersection, you're going to have what we call a turning maneuver. And that also has to be in compliance. But Since you don't have a turning maneuver, you don't need a landing. Now, this ramp, of course, does not have a detectable warning surface. Now, it does have a depressed curve, and you need to know that as well. This is a depressed curve. As I move on, when we deal with perpendicular curve ramps, well, you have some at 90 degrees with a pedestrian path, and that's what this ramp is. Now, a perpendicular ramp is installed perpendicular to the pedestrian path. Now, the pedestrian in the sidewalk will use the ramp and turn 90 degrees and then continue. Since the pedestrian must turn, a landing is required. Okay, this right here is what we would call a landing. You're coming here, you're turning, and you're going to come down, or you're going to go up, and you're going to turn. This area, and like I said, I'm going to show you how we measure the slope and the cross slope. Right now, you need to know what type of ramp you're looking at, because all these ramps are popular. And when we go out and inspect the ramps, one thing that does boggle my mind is nobody knows what type of ramp that they're looking at. Now, and as you know, there's no detectable warning surface here. And again, this is in the state of Pennsylvania. So Indiana, we're not the only state that uses these grooves. Now, the problem I always have with these grooves, and that's another subject, is if they get filled with water, they can freeze and ice will form. But that's what we call a perpendicular curved ramp. Now we have a diagonal curved ramp. This is your detectable warning surface. This would be if you're measuring in from the street to the depressed curve and down from the detectable warning surface. That would be your algebraic sum. And it's called a diagonal because it sits at a diagonal, but you have two crosswalks. So, as you know, diagonal ramps are single curved ramps that provide two directional crossings. This may appear as an efficient curved ramp, but in fact, it is the most undesirable installation. Now, here's why diagonal ramps are undesirable. Why? Because when you are doing a turning movement, or let's say you have turning traffic, you may not see pedestrians. Landing requirements in the street are difficult to construct. Directional cues are not provided for pedestrians with visual disabilities. And also, future pedestrian push button requirements may further complicate the diagonal installation. And approval of the ADE will be required when the turning maneuver is not entirely on to the sidewalk. Here we have what we call a type 1 ramp. Now, as you see, there's information. This is your cross slope. It's generally 4 feet. Your cross slope must be at least 2% max. This right here is your detectable warning surface, 24, which is 2 feet by 4 feet. Then you have your depressions, 10% max. Then, of course, this is your slope at 8.33. This is a type 1 curved ramp. Now, type 1 curved ramps have been commonly used. Unfortunately, many of them have been installed incorrectly. Type curved ramps must have a landing where turns are performed. So basically a maximum of 8.33 ramp slope, 10% maximum layer slopes, and they must be installed perpendicular to the curve Any of these ramps were installed without a landing, causing a person in a wheelchair. That's right, a person in a wheelchair has to utilize these ramps, or a blind person also has to utilize these ramps. But basically, with many of these ramps, they have been installed without a landing, and it's going to cause a person, or which it has caused a person in a wheelchair, to cross an uneven surface caused by the ramp and flares. The other mistake is, if you look at those flares at the end, they're very, very steep. 10% is steep. And that is a common mistake. Very steep flare slope. So if the flare is in the pedestrian path, it must be 10% or flatter. This curb ramp is ideal when installed correctly. However, a wide sidewalk is recovered. Now, these are flares. You need a wide sidewalk. Basically, your sidewalks, and every state has this issue. Every state. I live here in Indiana. I used to live in Pennsylvania, so I dealt with a lot of these ramps in Pennsylvania. We had to remove a number of them just to make sure they were right, especially in Allentown. All right, we have a type 1A ramp. Again, 8.33 max, 5-foot minimum sidewalk. Here's your radius, your detectable warning surface, 24 feet wide. Grade break at the end of the radial curve. And this right here is your return curve. Now, type 1A ramps ramp the sidewalk down to a level landing. Now, this curb ramp is commonly installed on narrow sidewalks. Truncated domes may be installed radial as shown, or in a linear function. So if you're in Pennsylvania, you need to see RC-67M for more details on truncated dome installations. And that's the design specification. We move on to a type 2 ramp. As you see, this is your slope, 8.33, 5 feet across, 5-foot medium of minimum, detectable warning surface, and your cross slope, 2%. Now, type 2 ramps also ramp the sidewalk down to a level landing, where the pedestrian would either turn to cross the street or continue up the opposite side ramp to continue on the sidewalk. This ramp is normally installed on narrow sidewalks. So basically, one negative aspect of this curb ramp is the pedestrian is forced to use the curb ramp even if they're not crossing the street. Now we have the type 3 ramp. Now, again, type 3 ramps, that's what it is here. They basically bring the street up to the sidewalk. There is very limited applications of this type of curb ramp. Why? Because snow removal may damage this ramp, and it should be considered as a last resort to other curb ramp types. Now we have a type 4 ramp. Generally see a lot of these out in the streets. Now, type 4 curb ramps are similar to type 1 curb ramps, except instead of flares, the type 4 uses a curb return. This is acceptable when the curb return is not in the pedestrian path. As shown in this picture, the grass is separating the pedestrian zone from the curb and thus creating a burnishing zone. Graphic on the top left depicts a parallel installation. The graphic on the bottom left depicts a perpendicular installation with the landing. And here's what the curb ramp looks like. 8.33, 8.33. Here's your sidewalk. Take the cross slopes here. Each cross slope again must be 2% or less. And here are some pictures. And even if you don't live in the state of Pennsylvania, everybody does the same thing. You need to know what type of curb ramp you are looking at when you inspect it. Very important. Then we have the type 4A ramp. You have your flared sections here, your detectable warning surface, your slope, your cross slope, and your sidewalk. Now, type 4A ramps are almost identical to type 1 curb ramps with a major difference. A type 4 curb ramp uses a steep 24-inch flare, which is 2 feet. Now, this is acceptable when the flare is not in the pedestrian path. Now, what's shown in the picture, the grass is separating the pedestrian zone from the curb and thus creating a furnishing zone. And the 24-inch flare may be used when the flare is adjacent to a permanent obstruction, such as a street sign, that would protect the pedestrian from walking across the steep flare. The graphic on the top left depicts a parallel installation. The graphic on the bottom left depicts a perpendicular installation with a landing. And here's what they're talking about right here. This is a type 4A ramp. Now, in Pennsylvania, when they inspect these ramps, they use what we call a form 4401. Looks like an Excel spreadsheet. That's what they use. But that's what a type 4A ramp looks like. Then there's a type 5 ramp. Now, from the previous version of the RC67M, type 5 curb ramps use a railing. For a pedestrian with a visual disability, the railing may become an obstruction. Therefore, this type of ramp is no longer used and has been removed from the standards. So some of your old standards, here's the railing right here. Here's the railing. It's no longer used now. We have a type 6 ramp. Now, the type 6 ramp uses multiple ramps with an intermediate level landing to transition the curb height. Now, the pedestrian from the sidewalk would traverse down a ramp to a landing, make a 90-degree turn, and then traverse down a second ramp to cross the street. This ramp can only be installed when a furnishing zone or grass strip exists. Talking about all this. Again, you can see the dimensions. What you need when you inspect the ramps. Generally, again, your sidewalk is 4 to 5 feet wide, 8.33 max for your slopes, cross slope, 2% max. Type A, open, median, or we call it a type A median opening. Now, a type A median opening will provide a cut through for narrowed raised medians. Truncated domes, which these are truncated domes on your detectable warning surface, will be installed on both sides of the median opening behind the depressed curb. The opening must be 5 feet to provide enough room for passing wheelchairs. The raised median shall be 6 feet wide to provide adequate refuge for a pedestrian in a wheelchair being pushed by another pedestrian on foot. Then we have the type B opening. Flares, remember I told you about the 24-inch flares? Here's your width right here, 5 feet. Detectable warning surfaces. Now, generally, type B median openings are very similar to type A. Type B uses a 24-inch rolled flare. This is acceptable since it is not in the pedestrian path. Again, truncated domes are located on both sides to mark the travel lanes. That's what you have here. And then you have the blended transition. Now, the blended transitions are very similar to type 2 curb ramps, except all slopes are 5% or less. The guidelines separate blended transitions from other curves, other curb ramps, so that the RC 67M followed this practice. So again, need to understand this. All of the slopes for most of these ramps were 8.33%. Now, with these blended transitions, when you go out, and this is why you need to know what type of curve that you're dealing with. You need to have slopes 5% or less. So basically, this is your depressed curve. You have your 2% max. You have your 24-inch detectable warning surface, and this landing right here. And this, well, it's not a landing, it's a slope. And this slope right here, instead of it being 8.33, it's 5%. And that's why you need to know what type of ramp that you're looking at. Many people don't know. If an inspector went out to inspect this ramp and he didn't know, he would say this ramp, okay, it's still in spec, but he would think, let's say you get a 6%, 7% on the slope. He would think that this ramp is in compliance because it's not greater than 8.33. But since it's a blended transition, it will be out of spec because it's greater than 5%. And every city should be reminded of how to inspect blended transitions. Of course, they're similar to type 2 ramps, but the specifications are different. Now, the guidelines separate blended transitions from other curve ramps. So the RC 67M follows the practice. And if you need to know more about your ADA ramps, well, you have different designs of what the ADA ramps look like. Now, what if your ADA ramps are out of spec, or you utilize a TIF? A TIF is a technically and feasibility form. And on that form, you explain why the ADA ramp is out of spec. Be some type of field condition. Be where you had to add a return curve. It could be where you had an obstruction. It could be a hole on the outside, a sign on the outside, which caused you to create, I wouldn't create a 11 or 12% flare. I would utilize return curves. That's basically why you utilize return curves, so you don't have to create flares, because remember, all your flares have to be minimum of 10%. But again, what I just showed you tonight were types of curve ramps. Now, again, these ramps are in Pennsylvania, but each state and each city basically has the same specifications. Remember, the ADA is the American Disabilities Act. That's federal. And when you build any building, and I'm going to get into that act, I'm going to get in that act when I do some more videos, because many of us don't know that when you build a building, you have to have some bathrooms, you may even have to have some rooms that are ADA compliant. You may even have to have curb ramps at your building. Now, I've seen some curb ramps, some office buildings, or some ramps with railings. But that's a different video. But what I wanted to present tonight are the types of curb ramps. where you find these curb ramps. And generally, you're going to find most of them in your municipal areas. And they should be checked. Utilize a smart level. You have to calibrate your smart level and then record all of your measurements. And basically, tell you something, a lot of your detectable warning surfaces are basically 2x4, except for your ones that are on a radius. Also, generally, you check your slope, 8.33, most of your ramps, and then you check your cross slope, which is maximum 2%. Now, when it comes to your blended transition, like I said, your maximum for your slopes is 5%. Then you have your algebraic sum, you have your width of your sidewalks. And when you inspect those ramps, make sure you have a calibrated smart level. Because when it comes to construction, there are a number of these ramps that have been installed incorrectly. Then you have to remove them. Then you have to rebuild them. And in the end, that costs time and money. And when you're building any type of structure, what you want to avoid at all times is reworks, because reworks, they slow the production down. And sometimes they even change the schedule. So as a contractor, make sure you follow the plans and specifications. And when you're an inspector, make sure that the contractor is following the plans and specifications. Because when it comes to curb ramps, it's our job to make sure that they're installed properly. Because not only do handicapped personnel use the curb ramps, but people like me, people like you use those curb ramps. So understand the standard drawings when it comes to these ramps. And if you have any questions, ask your area engineer, ask your project manager, ask your ADA design engineer. And if they don't know, go up and even ask your department engineer. But read the specs, make sure you have a good smart level, and look at the standard drawings. Because the last thing you want to do is to remove and replace. Because in construction, time is money. And that concludes this topic on types of curb ramps. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some political and social content, you can check out my main channel, the 411 Talk Zone radio show channel. And here's where you can find me on that channel. The 411 Talk Zone radio show channel. You can find me on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, Rumble, and you can also find me on True Social. Now for the QCIS channel, you can also find me on YouTube. Also find me on X, formerly Twitter, and LinkedIn. And once again, thank you for viewing this topic on types of curb ramps from the QCIS channel. On this channel, on the QCIS channel, get all you need with STEM. Because this is your STEM channel. And I'm here to give you everything you need about STEM. Most of it is going to be overviews, but in the end, you're going to get good education. And I'm also trying to help people get into engineering and construction. Because right here on the QCIS channel, what I'm going to give you is a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Until next time, Thank you for viewing this channel. But my name is Leon Jones, and stay tuned for more videos from the QCIS channel. Again, on this channel, get a daily dose, science, technology, engineering, and math. And one more time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful and gracious evening.